Well, it's just a little bit after 11, so I think I'm going to begin right now. I imagine some people will be entering as the presentation goes on, which is just fine. I think I'll be able to explain everything to them as we proceed. I just want to remind everyone that Beasley Allen offers these webinars through our events page on our website. I believe the website is simply beasleyallen.com/events, which will allow you to register for similar webinars that happen in the future. But today's webinar is brought to you by myself, Charlie Stern, and it is Asbestos Litigation, Medical and Legal Aspects. I run the Mesothelioma and Asbestos Practice Group for Beasley Allen, and I am based out of our Dallas, Texas office. So today we're going to be talking about a number of different things. They're basic in terms of asbestos litigation, but they will give you all a primer as to how the litigation works, its current state, and where I believe it's going. So first, we're going to talk about what is asbestos. We'll talk a little bit about the various diseases that are associated with asbestos exposure. I'll give you a primer on a mesothelioma case in chief. Essentially, I'll show you what it is that we try to prove at trial in mesothelioma cases. I'll talk about the history of asbestos litigation, the current state of asbestos litigation, and a little bit about where I think litigation is going. So what is asbestos? I imagine every single person that's listening to this webinar has heard of asbestos. Everyone has probably seen, unless they're living underneath a rock, those commercials that are on CNN or Fox News that say, if you or a loved one have been diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease, to call a certain number. Well, asbestos is actually a generic term. It's a commercial term that's used for a group of 6 mineral silicates. These are naturally occurring mineral fibers that grow in the earth. And all of these fibers, whether they are one of the 6 types, are very strong, they're very flexible, they're resistant to breakdown, non-biodegradable, and environmentally persistent. So those are the very things that made asbestos a very useful commodity and why it was utilized in thousands of products during the 1900s. But it's also the very reasons that these fibers are so dangerous to the human body. The same reason that they were useful in tools and in equipment is the same reason the human body can't break them down, and they cause so many different diseases. So what are the basic kinds of asbestos fibers? Well, like I said, there are 6. Some people consider there to be 7, but truly there are 6. One is serpentine or chrysotile. That is that white fibrous material that you see right there next to a quarter. So that is what it looks like when you actually mine it out of the ground. Chrysotile asbestos is unique because it comprised about 93 to 95% of all asbestos fibers that were utilized in the United States in various applications. The other kind of asbestos is called the amphibole asbestos, and that was used in about 7 to 5% of all materials and equipment that utilized asbestos. Those amphibole fibers are known as actinolite, amosite, amphiphyolite, chrysotolite, and tremolite. So those fibers are going to be longer and straighter and a little bit more narrow. It's agreed upon by our experts and the experts of defendants that the amphibole fibers are generally more dangerous. What's not agreed upon, though, is whether chrysotile fibers are dangerous at all. It's obviously the plaintiff's position in this litigation that chrysotile fibers are very dangerous and cause mesothelioma, along with the other diseases associated with asbestos. The defendants in this litigation, for the most part, disagree. In terms of what the regulatory bodies believe in the United States and around the world, it's commonly agreed that chrysotile fibers cause mesothelioma and they cause other asbestos-related diseases. It's really only one place in the entire world where that isn't agreed upon, and that's in American courtrooms. And this is very important because, as I stated earlier, 93 to 95% of all asbestos utilized in the United States was chrysotile. So if the defendants argue that chrysotile is not dangerous, well, that's them arguing that 93 to 95% of the materials that were utilized in the United States could not be responsible for the disease that's being alleged in a court of law. So where was asbestos used and where do you still find it in the United States? Well, up until about 1975, it was used in thousands of different products. I think the estimate is around 3,500 products that asbestos was utilized in one form or another. It was in cars, and usually that was in the brakes or the clutches or the gasket material. It was in building material, such as joint compound and drywall. It was used extensively in shipbuilding. Most of the ships that were steam powered during the 1900s had asbestos-containing insulated pipes that ran throughout the ship. It also had asbestos in gaskets and packing, valves, pumps, turbines, boilers, all sorts of stuff. Especially in an industrial facility or in the construction industry, you couldn't really throw a stone and not hit something that contained asbestos. Up until the 1990s, it was also contaminated in something called vermiculite. Vermiculite was mined out in Montana, and it's another insulation material, and it would be contaminated with asbestos and utilized throughout the 1990s or up until the 1990s. And one very common area where asbestos is found that's not listed on this slide, but I should have listed it, is talcum powder. I think everyone has probably heard about talcum powder and it being contaminated with asbestos. The most famous example of that currently is Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. Johnson & Johnson's baby powder had asbestos in it. Where talc forms is very similar in nature to where asbestos forms in the ground. So you had types of asbestos forming alongside those talcum deposits, including tremolite and amphibole. And essentially, when you would mine the talc, you could not avoid also mixing in some of that alongside asbestos. So it's not just Johnson & Johnson baby powder, though. There's something called industrial talc as well, which was used in a number of industries, including the paint industry and the rubber industry. And there's a portion of New York, upstate New York, called the Governor region, where that talcum powder was mined and milled, and it also is contaminated with high levels of amphibole and tremolite asbestos, which are two of the amphibole fibers that we talked about earlier. So where do you find asbestos currently? Well, in older homes and commercial buildings. If a house was built or a building was built in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, there is most likely some asbestos in there unless it was remediated. And what that means is literally going into that facility and removing that asbestos via different methods. So asbestos in place can be dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as asbestos that isn't in place, that's loose, that's crumbling, or disturbed. And you will still find some asbestos in some brake pads, some clutches, some roofing material, vinyl tiles, and some cement pipes. Essentially, if those products were made or installed back in the 1970s, 1980s, well, that asbestos is still going to be in place. And this can be a real risk factor for a lot of people who are working with these sewer systems, working with brake pads, removing clutches. Current day automotive mechanics can still be exposed to asbestos if those brakes and those clutches are old. And then, of course, we have naturally occurring asbestos, which is found in the United States in various areas. There are large mines in California. There are the mines that I mentioned up in the Governor region of New York. And then Canada also has a big city there, which used to be named Asbestos, Canada. They've gone ahead and remarketed the name and changed it. But there were giant mines up there as well, where most of that chrysotile asbestos came from. Now, what I'm going to do is I see a couple Q of A's popping up to my right. As opposed to taking them kind of piecemeal, we'll wait till the end and I'll address all of those. But I didn't mention when we started, please, if you have any questions, feel free to ask and we'll circle back to those at the very end. So what are the populations at risk? Well, you have the folks who were exposed a long time ago. You have folks who worked with asbestos in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s who later on will develop these diseases. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happens as we move forward. But those are the mechanics, the construction workers, the shipyard workers, and military personnel. What we see in those commercials that I mentioned to start the presentation very often are veterans. And the reason we see veterans is because asbestos was utilized extensively in the U.S. Navy, also in the Army, also in the Air Force, but mostly in the Navy. All of our warships during World War II and leading up through the 1980s were insulated with asbestos-containing insulation. We also had pumps and valves and turbines and boilers that utilized asbestos-containing gaskets, packing, and insulation. So we have many, many veterans who worked with these products who come home 20, 30, 40, or 50 years later who end up being diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease. This second sort of area of past exposure that we have to be worried about are not the folks who actually worked with the asbestos themselves, but people who worked in workplaces where asbestos was being worked on. So there's a famous doctor named Dr. Irvin J. Selikoff, who's sort of the grandfather of asbestos medical research. And he had a famous quote in the 60s that essentially stated, asbestos does not know job classifications. If someone is working with asbestos in a facility, and there are people in not just the immediate area, but within 30, 40, 50 yards, that asbestos fiber gets mixed up in the air and blows about, and individuals can be exposed to that asbestos and get sick later on, even if they themselves are not working with it. And then the third area of exposure that we have, which is very common in the litigation and becoming even more common, are folks who have household contact. These are take-home exposure cases. What this means is the individual is living with someone who worked around or with asbestos. They themselves never worked with asbestos, may have never even seen any asbestos, but their father or their brother or their mother will come home covered in asbestos dust, which is invisible. And that brother or sister, that daughter, someone will do the laundry, shake out those clothes, and do that for 10, 15 years. And that's plenty of exposure, enough exposure to cause these asbestos-related diseases that we'll talk about later. And to this day, you still have folks being exposed in sort of the areas that we were talking about earlier. You have construction workers, you have mechanics, you have people who live in homes that may have asbestos in those homes that they aren't even aware of. And then you have some folks who can have environmental exposures if they're living in or around a area where asbestos was mined or utilized extensively. So what are the sort of common exposure pathways? Well, it's pretty obvious. The most common is inhalation of fibers. And that's what's going to cause all the real problems. Essentially, it's simple enough. Asbestos gets into the air because it gets disturbed. You can't hardly see it if you can see it at all. And you breathe it in and you can't clear the asbestos fibers out. And that causes problems for you down the line. Now, there are other minor pathways that can cause some problems, but they're not nearly as severe. And that would be ingestion via water or dermal contact on your skin. But that's not going to cause the cancers to the extent that we're really focused on today or that we'll be talking about today. So what's the biologic fate of an asbestos fiber? Well, you have these tiny little microscopic fibers. They're called asbestos bodies. And a thimble, I'll show you later, can fit billions of these fibers. You literally cannot see these unless you have a microscope that has the ability to almost see into space. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it is absolutely ridiculous how small these things are. And they get breathed into the lung space, and they can't be cleared out. Some of them can get cleared out because the nose does a good job and the lungs are very capable of clearing things that aren't supposed to be in your body, but a lot of them don't. And they get stuck in what's called the pleural or peritoneal spaces. And what those are the thin membrane layers that surround either your lungs or your stomach. So they get caught there, and they essentially, over a long period of time, cause genetic and DNA damage, which results in cancer. So that's sort of what we're talking about there. It's the pathogenesis of the disease itself. So how does that happen? Well, it's direct interaction with cellular macromolecules, and that causes stress. It causes inflammation. It causes cell-mediated mechanisms. And this leads to all sorts of injuries, including fibrosis, which is essentially just scarring. But if it happens long enough and it happens bad enough, it can lead to cancer. The bottom line is asbestos is genotoxic, it injures the genes, and it's carcinogenic. It causes cancer. So what are some of the common diseases that are associated with asbestos? Well, the first that people really documented is called asbestosis. Y'all may have heard of asbestosis, and all that is, it's the scarring of the lining of the lungs caused specifically by asbestos. There's something called pneumoconiosis, and that is just a disease induced by dust exposure. And asbestosis is a pneumoconiosis specifically caused by asbestos. Now, asbestosis is unique because it requires prolonged and heavy exposures to asbestos. These were the folks back in the 1920s who first started getting sick because of asbestos exposure. These were people who worked in massive asbestos mines, or they worked in factories that were actually using asbestos raw material, and they were covered in the stuff every day, all day for 20 or 30 years. Well, they noticed that these people who were 40 years old after working in these industries for 20 years or so were dying. They couldn't breathe, and there was fibrosis and scarring all over their lungs. So people identified asbestos very early on as being the cause of this. There's also lung carcinoma. That's just lung cancer. Everyone knows that lung cancer can be caused by smoking cigarettes. It can also be caused by a number of other factors. Asbestos is one of those. So if you breathe in enough asbestos, you can also get your traditional lung cancer that people get when they smoke cigarettes or from any other thing. Now, the famous one is Plural Mesothelioma, and that's the one I've been kind of talking about most specifically. That's the one where the fibers get caught in the pleura, they can't be expelled, and over time, they cause cancer. The common misconception about mesothelioma is that it's a lung cancer. It's not lung cancer. It's very, very different. It's actually the lining of the lung, that thin mesothelial layer that becomes cancer-ridden, and that's the issue that you have there. It's not actually going to be a traditional lung cancer. And then there's also non-respiratory diseases. There's peritoneal mesothelioma. It's the same idea as plural mesothelioma, but instead of it being the lining of the lung, it's the lining of the stomach. That usually requires a little bit heavier exposures. Certainly defendants in the litigation argue that. And there's also correlation with other cancers, colon cancer, esophageal cancer, that the science is not quite as strong, but there is certainly connections between asbestos exposure and other diseases. So what about lung cancer? Similar to asbestosis, you really do require a heavier dose, a more common or frequent dose, and a longer period of time for that dose of asbestos to get lung cancer induced by asbestos. And smoking history, especially when we're evaluating these cases, is going to be very important. So everyone knows that smoking cigarettes can cause lung cancer. Everyone kind of knows that being around asbestos can cause lung cancer as well. But if you do both, if you smoke and are exposed to asbestos, there's a synergistic effect. And there's medical literature out there that suggests that your likelihood of getting lung cancer when you have both asbestos exposures and a history of cigarette smoking is 100 times greater. So in other words, it acts independently upon you, the asbestos, to make that cigarette smoking even worse. So when we're evaluating cases for lung cancer, those are still litigated, but it's very important for us to look at the smoking history. And that's just from a practical perspective, is how we can, move forward with a lawsuit and try to convince people causation when you have someone who was smoking cigarettes as well, which obviously contributes and causes lung cancer as well. One of the important things that you have to keep in mind with all of these diseases, whether it be the lung cancer or the mesothelioma, is something called the latency period. And that's one of the things that makes these cases difficult. You have people who work with asbestos in their 20s, but it requires, and this is what the latency period is, it requires 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes 70 years from their exposure period to when they actually get the disease. So you have to go back in time essentially and try to identify where they were exposed to asbestos and how they were exposed to understand what caused their mesothelioma or their lung cancer. So back to malignant mesothelioma of the pleura. This is the one that we've been talking about. Tumor arises from the thin serosal membrane surrounding the lungs. It's rapidly invasive. There is no cure. It's incurable. It kills people usually within 12 to 24 months. There have been some advancements in the treatment over the past 3 or 4 years. The FDA recently approved a new medication. It's a immunotherapy cocktail that allows individuals to get a little bit longer lease on life. But we aren't talking about 5 years here. We're talking about an extra 4 to 6 months are what the studies showed are giving people. So when we get a case of a malignant mesothelioma, if the individual is, let's say, 70 years old at diagnosis, it's very important to get that case on file quickly. It's very important to have that individual deposed very, very quickly. In all likelihood, they will not be there for their trial. We utilize preservation depositions in every single case with the hope that we don't need to use it, and they're healthy enough in 14 to 18 to 22 months, whenever that trial rolls around. But the realistic nature of the litigation requires us to preserve that testimony so that it can be played someday in court if needed. And mesothelioma also has that long latency period. We're talking about 30 or 40 years, sometimes even more. The important thing two important things to know about mesothelioma, though, that aren't on the slide. Number one, very low exposures to asbestos cause it. We're pretty confident that background levels of asbestos that may just be in the air naturally do not cause it. But elevated levels of asbestos, whether through an occupational exposure, what we call a para-occupational exposure, that take-home exposure, are known to cause mesothelioma, all fiber types, whether it be chrysotile or the amphiboles. And this is very important. There was a meeting in 1997 in Helsinki, Finland, where a bunch of scientists, I think there were 19 of them, got together. They were all the preeminent mesothelioma and asbestos scientists and medical doctors in the world. And they got together and they wanted to figure out, okay, how can we attribute or come up with a criteria to determine whether a asbestos-related disease is actually attributable to asbestos? And what they did for mesothelioma is they said, okay, all you have to show, the correlation, the connection, the causation is so strong that all we need to know is there a history of elevated exposure? Did that occur? And if that occurred, and you can identify that by taking a medical history of the patient, then that's enough to attribute that mesothelioma to that exposure or that cumulative exposure that happened over time. So there doesn't need to be a certain amount. There doesn't have to be, X dose fibers per cc years, which is how we measure asbestos fiber dosage. You don't need that. You just need to find the history, find the exposure, and that's enough to attribute mesothelioma to asbestos. The same isn't true for lung cancer. The same isn't true for asbestosis, but for mesothelioma, it is. So then you have peritoneal mesothelioma. This is of the abdomen. It's similar in nature into how it's caused. Asbestos fibers are breathed in, they get caught, but they actually get caught in the stomach as opposed to the lungs. It's a little more rare, but it's also rapidly invasive and rapidly fatal. So this is the patient history that we were just talking about. This is more for doctors, but it's also very useful for lawyers, especially when you're intaking a case. Because when you intake a case, most of the time how it works is someone comes to you with mesothelioma, or they think they have mesothelioma, but they have no idea how they were exposed to asbestos. Because most of these folks didn't know that they were working with asbestos, were never told that there was asbestos in some of the products they were working with. So you start from scratch and you essentially construct retroactively their history and potential for exposure, and you try to identify that. And when you identify that, that's how you build your defendant list. There are ways that we do this. It's not the easiest thing in the world. We use coworkers, we use documents, we use documents related to premises, but we figure it out, and that's how we construct the lawsuit. And then also you're going to want to know the medical history. But interestingly, and most people may not know this, there is zero connection between smoking cigarettes and mesothelioma. Literally none. It's not very often that the experts in our litigation agree on anything, but that's one thing they have to agree on. Smoking doesn't cause or contribute or is even correlated to mesothelioma. I often bring MILs because most of my clients did smoke, at least at one point in their life. But I'll bring an MIL to keep that information away from the jury. There's no reason the jury needs to know that. It's completely irrelevant because all it's trying to do is paint the plaintiff in a bad light, that he made some bad decisions or she made some bad decisions, ignored warnings or something to that effect. But it has no relevant relationship to the medical causation of that person's mesothelioma. And those motions are almost always granted. I think maybe in the history of me trying these cases, I may have lost one of those. And that was on an issue related to warnings and whether the person disregarded certain warnings on cigarettes and how that may be relevant to them disregarding a potential warning on on an asbestos product. So let's do a little bit of a breakdown of a mesothelioma case in chief. This is some of the stuff that I would explain to a jury during an opening statement. Just like any other case, there are four things from the plaintiff's perspective that we're really trying to prove. Only one of them is kind of unique to this sort of case, and that's the exposure angle. But other than that, we have to prove causation, liability, and damages. So what is exposure? We've talked about these types of asbestos. That brown type to the left there under the word mineral, that's amosite. That's an amphibole fiber that's found mostly in South Africa and Australia. It's very, very dangerous, and it was utilized in mostly insulation and a couple other products, but you would find it mostly in industrial facilities and on ships wrapped around pipes. So there were steam pipes that had to be insulated. And this amosite mixed with chrysotile was utilized to insulate those pipes. And then you have on the right, the Canadian kind called chrysotile. That's the white one. That's the one that the defendants in this litigation say is not dangerous. I've heard them refer to it as the quote unquote friendly fiber. Well, there's really nothing friendly about it. OSHA, EPA, NIOSH, IARC, every single regulatory agency that has ever examined it says that it's dangerous. But it wasn't until just this year, April of 2022, that the EPA finally moved to officially ban the use of chrysotile in the United States. Up until that, we were one of the few countries alongside places like China, Russia, and a few others that still were able to utilize asbestos, at least chrysotile asbestos. We didn't utilize a lot of it, and it was very, very regulated in just a limited number of applications. But defendants in the litigation could always point to the fact that it's not even illegal. People can still use it to this day. Well, that's not going to be the case for much longer, most likely. I think it was April 4th of this year that the EPA finally moved in the Federal Register to propose the ban. There's a 60-day comment period, but it's what we're being told or what we believe it's going to be banned and no longer will be able to be used. So there still will be asbestos in the United States in those kind of legacy uses where it was already installed and utilized, but you won't be getting new products that contain asbestos anymore. So why is asbestos so dangerous? Well, I always tell jurors it doesn't have any of the onion properties. When you're cutting an onion, your body alerts you that there's something wrong about this. You don't want to get it in your eyes. It smells bad. It makes you cry, etc. Asbestos doesn't have any of those things. Your body has no idea that what it's inhaling is dangerous. You can't taste it. You can't see it. You can't smell it. And you don't even know necessarily that it's around you. If you can see asbestos dust, that means there are billions of fibers around you. That means that the exposures that you're suffering are massive and could be very, very serious. In most applications where you're utilizing asbestos, you can't see it. If you're scraping a gasket or if you're pulling up packing material, you may see some fibers, you may see a little bit of dust, but that's just sort of what's visible. There's so much more behind it that you can't see that you're going to be inhaling just naturally because it's in your breathing space. Again, here are those commercial forms of asbestos. The one that we haven't talked about in depthly is the blue asbestos. That's chrysotile. Chrysotile is the worst, far and above. Some people say it's 500 times as potent as the other kinds. It is used very, very limitedly, at least it was in the United States. It was used more in some other countries. But here in the States, mostly it was used in cement pipe and cement products, very strong for binding that material together. But what you would have are individuals, whether they were working on pipes later on or they were actually in the manufacturing process of those pipes, they would have to cut those pipes and mix that asbestos. So you had a large number of individuals. I tried a case about 2 years ago involving a gentleman who he had 10 cuts of 4-inch cement pipe, 10 cuts. Each one of those cuts was about 30 seconds. So that's, not very long in terms of the overall scheme of his life and that exposure. Yet he had mesothelioma with no other exposures. And we tied it back to that chrysotile pipe that he was cutting during those 10 cuts. There's that thimble. Everyone knows how big a thimble is. Everyone may not know how many fibers can fit in that thimble, but we're talking about billions and billions of fibers. And most of the products that utilized asbestos weren't just comprised of asbestos. There were other things in there as well. So what you're seeing isn't just asbestos, but when it gets up in the air, it's the asbestos that's actually dangerous. So here are some more facts about mesothelioma. First, it's a signature disease. It's actually the quintessential signature disease. And that's going back to that sort of Helsinki criteria. That was that Finland meeting that I met, that document I mentioned, that document that they came out with, they called it the Helsinki criteria. And what they said is that asbestos and mesothelioma is a signature disease of asbestos. If you see that mesothelioma, it's presumed that it was caused by asbestos, especially if you're able to identify via the history that it was or there was an asbestos exposure. Like I said, it's always fatal. It's very, very painful. The course that an individual goes through when they're diagnosed with mesothelioma over the next 12 to 18 to 24 months is horribly sad and horrific to watch. You have a gentleman maybe who is 65 to 70 years old, who is, say, 6 foot, 200 pounds or 180 pounds. By the time you speed up to 24 months later and he's on his deathbed, he usually weighs about 105 pounds. They lose almost half of their body weight, their skin and bones, and they pass away essentially from asphyxiation. At some point, their lungs become so riddled with the cancer that they're no longer able to lift themselves up via their diaphragm to breathe. And they can pass away before that due to other things like infection or pneumonia. But it's a horrific sight. It really is. And it's something that all of our clients, unfortunately, deal with at some point in time after being diagnosed. And the important thing to remember is it's 100% preventable. We're going to get into a little bit more about the liability story as I move forward today. But the knowledge that asbestos hurt people was known in the 1900s. We're talking about the early 1900s, around the turn of the century. By the 1920s, everyone knew that asbestosis was caused by asbestos. As the years progressed, everyone realized that cancer could be caused by asbestos as well. And before the 1900s, the early 1900s, and looking back through the medical literature at old autopsies and looking at people describing tumors, there was no mesothelioma. It is a disease that has been born via the commercial use of asbestos. We have studies that we utilize in trial where individuals have gone through registries at major hospitals, through the autopsy registries, and look to see, okay, were any of these cancers that are being described around the lung, around the stomach, could any of these have been mesothelioma back in the 1800s or the 1700s? And they're not. They're not mesotheliomas. We have them now because asbestos is utilized. It's mined and milled and put into products. And had it not been utilized, or at least people been warned, this disease would not be what it is today. So causation, we won't get too into the causation angle because it is kind of technical in nature. But bottom line, individuals breathe in asbestos through their mouth and their nose. Like I said, your body has a very good defense mechanism, and it's able to expel lots of stuff that you breathe in that should not be there. The problem is those asbestos fibers that we've described are so strong and resistant to be broken down that they get stuck in there, or at least some of them do. A lot of them are cleared. Your body does a good job in getting a lot of them out of there. But the ones that remain over time can cause serious and significant damage, the worst of which, of course, is going to be mesothelioma. Real quick, just to give you an image. So this is just a healthy lung. We show the actual pictures of the lungs a lot of times for jurors. I didn't think it was necessary to show one of the lungs after a mesothelioma diagnosis for this presentation. But you see this layer right here. That is the cancer. And it looks like the rind of an orange when you actually see one of these lungs and it's been encased in this cancerous tumor. So it's very aggressive, and they start usually very, very small, and then it just encases the lung entirely or the stomach entirely. And the reason it's so painful is, as you can see, here's the diaphragm at the bottom. There's nerve centers along the diaphragm and the lung itself. And when those nerve centers become trapped and pinched, it creates shooting pains in these people's sides. And that's one of the ways people first realize they have mesothelioma. Oh, I take that back. They realize there's something wrong. They don't know they have mesothelioma, but they start having these sharp, sharp pains in their sides and in their back, and they have trouble sleeping and laying down. And it leads them to the doctor. And after, doing various tests and trying to figure out what's going on, they determine that, okay, this is mesothelioma. And that's only determined via a biopsy, where you take a little portion of that tumor and you test it. So it's a cumulative disease. What does that mean? Well, it's just like smoking. You can't look at a smoker who has smoked 2 packs a day for 40 years and say, okay, it was that last cigarette that he smoked before he was diagnosed that caused that disease. Now, it's not how it works, and no doctor would say that's how it works. It's the cumulative dose caused by all of those cigarettes. And asbestos is no different. The only thing about asbestos, which is unique in terms of mesothelioma, is that the cumulative dose doesn't have to be a certain amount. That cumulative dose can be small, but when it's that small cumulative dose, it's still the overall dose that caused the disease. And the way I explain this is pretty simple to jurors. It's just with a glass of water. When you're filling a glass of water drop by drop by drop, at some point it's going to overflow. But it's not that last drop that caused the cup to overflow. It's all of those drops joined together over time that eventually led to the overflow. It's just like mesothelioma and asbestos, drop by drop, fiber by fiber, your cumulative dose will eventually result in that cup overflowing and you getting the disease. Very important, and this is not me or my words. This is the words or are the words of the EPA, OSHA, NIOSH, World Health Organization, IARC, anyone who's ever looked at it. There is no known threshold of exposure to asbestos where mesothelioma has been observed not to occur. Once again, what that means is we don't have to reach a certain level of asbestos exposure to know that mesothelioma could have been caused by that asbestos. What we're pretty confident about is background levels of asbestos exposure don't cause mesothelioma. Why is that important? Well, I did say earlier that asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral fiber. I've also mentioned numerous times that asbestos has been utilized for over 100 years. What does that mean? That means there's asbestos in the background in some air. The defense attorneys will often try to say that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there's asbestos in this room we're sitting in today. We're all breathing it. That's not entirely true. There may be some limited amounts of asbestos in certain commercial or domestic buildings. There may be some outdoors in some areas, depending on where you are, but it's not quite that simple. But it is true that in certain areas, there's going to be background levels of asbestos that folks may be exposed to over the course of their life at one time or another. What we're confident in, that doesn't cause mesothelioma. So it does take a level above that, but what that level is above that, we haven't been able to figure it out. And that's why it's so important to keep exposure levels to an absolute minimum, if not zero. We talked about the consensus report in Helsinki. Those are those guys who got together, ladies and gentlemen, doctors who put together the idea behind, hey, if there's asbestos and there's mesothelioma, we know that the mesothelioma was caused by asbestos. And this is what practicing doctors do. This is how they diagnose mesothelioma. After they have the biopsy and the pathology report, and it's a confirmed mesothelioma, this is essentially how they say, okay, is it an asbestos-induced mesothelioma? Because there are a few other things that cause mesothelioma. I haven't mentioned those yet. They're very rare, few and far between. But if an individual had a excessive radiation therapy or treatment for another cancer in their life, maybe they had breast cancer and they received radiation therapy 20 years ago. Well, that radiation therapy is known to cause tumors, and it can and has caused mesotheliomas. There are also theories that erionite, which is it's another mineral fiber that can cause mesothelioma. And there's some theories that individuals who had simian flu could possibly get mesothelioma later on. And then if you have a serious injury to the pleura space where it's actually punctured, your lung is punctured, that wound can later on result in cell damage and genetic damage, which causes mesothelioma. But these are very, very rare. The vast majority of mesotheliomas are caused by asbestos. So once you rule those out and you find an asbestos exposure, you can say that that is the causative agent. Now, I want to make it very clear that defendants in the litigation don't agree with any of this. This is the position of the United States federal government, the World Health Organization, the plaintiffs' bar. Defendants, on the other hand, will argue that there are spontaneous mesotheliomas, that lots of people, particularly women, get mesothelioma. We don't know why. It just sort of happens. And that's not the position of really any other group outside of the defense bar and some of the experts who they've retained in these cases. And it's not to say that the experts are making things up, so to speak. That's not, obviously that wouldn't be able to be admitted into evidence. There's studies that have been conducted over the past 30 or 40 years, because this litigation is so old, that support the general opinions of the defense bar. And they utilize those studies and they're admitted into court frequently. With that said, the EPA and NIOSH and OSHA and the other regulatory bodies have all examined these studies and examined this material and come to the conclusion that all of these fibers are dangerous and that low doses of these fibers can cause mesothelioma. So here are some studies that I utilize, especially in low dose cases. These are all older case reports and epi studies, epidemiological studies. And what they show is just one day of asbestos exposure can cause mesothelioma. They track individuals, they detail individuals who had limited or reduced exposures compared to other folks, but they still get mesothelioma. So what about liability? Well, the liability in these cases is strong, but it's going to be defendant specific. So it depends who the defendants are in the case as to their specific liability story, but the general liability story can be essentially the same in all of these cases. As I've mentioned a few times, you have in the early 1900s, when the first reports of asbestosis happening are coming up, or asbestos causing death are happening. Then you have in the 1920s, asbestosis is recognized as a disease. And it's not just recognized by medical doctors. You will look back in time. I just did this recently in a corporate representative deposition where an individual on a railroad, they were operating in the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. And I took him through the workers' compensation statutes that were in place back in the 30s, in the 40s, and the 50s in those states. And the purpose of that was to prove knowledge or duty related to whether they should have known that asbestos was dangerous in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And each one of those states had on its workers' compensation statute recognized asbestosis as a disease. So with that said, the idea being you're operating in a state where you're subject to these workers' compensation laws, you obviously need to be aware of those workers' compensation laws, and they've recognized asbestos as a hazard to workers. So what happened in the 30s? Well, we started learning more. Two gentlemen over there in England, where they utilized a ton of asbestos in the textile industry, named Merriweather and Price. They looked at workers and they saw that these folks, not just the miners and the millers, were getting sick, but they also came up with some really simple solutions as to how to protect workers from asbestos exposure. The first recommendation was pretty simple: remove the asbestos. But they also recognized that if you can't do that and you weren't maybe able to do that during that time, well, there are some other ways that you can protect people. One is simply, and these are very simple, wet it down. If it's wet, it can't create a fiber and it can't get into the air and you can't breathe it. Number two, good ventilation systems. Number three, masks. Just wear a mask. If the mask fits properly, the amount of asbestos that is able to permeate and get through that mask is limited almost to zero. So these are the same steps that should have been utilized in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s. They were known in the 1930s and they work. Yet companies decided not really to implement these sorts of steps. And the last thing they said is simply warn. If the person is made aware and cognizant of the risk, they will take the necessary precautions to protect themselves. So as the years moved forward into the 40s and into the 50s, that's when the cancer tie became connected to asbestos. And the reason it took that long is that thing we talked about earlier, the latency period. So the asbestosis incidents occurred first, and then later on in the 40s and the 50s is when you started seeing people being diagnosed with cancers. So it wasn't until 1960 that we first said, okay, we know for sure mesothelioma is caused by asbestos. Actually, the Germans were saying it a bit before in the 1940s. We weren't reading a lot of their medical literature in the 1940s for a lot of good reasons. So it wasn't until a little bit later that the Americans and some other allied powers became aware of what was going on with asbestos, even though the Germans kind of had an idea about it before we did. But in 1960, Wagner published an epi study out of South Africa, epidemiological study out of South Africa that showed that these folks, the miners, the millers, the townspeople around the crucidolite mines were dying at alarming rates. And then in 1964, Irving Selikoff, the gentleman who I mentioned earlier, took it a step further and said, okay, it's not just the miners and the millers. He was studying the insulators union in New York. And he said the end product users, folks who are not mining the products, but are simply using the products, are also getting sick and also dying at alarming rates. And then in 1972, OSHA was established. I believe the OSHA Act was passed in late 1970, and it was essentially passed in response to asbestos. If you go back in time and you look at some of the newspaper articles that were being published in the major newspapers in the United States during the 1970s, the asbestos scare was real. People were dying at alarming rates. Workers were being exposed to massive amounts of asbestos. And it was a situation that the federal government had to create OSHA to get under control. Now we know that OSHA regulates all sorts of working conditions, but it all started with asbestos. And they put in standards since then that have essentially limited and reduced the amount that workers can legally be exposed to on any given day. That point is essentially zero now. So what about defendant-specific knowledge? Well, that's going to depend on the industry. But these documents and these industries knew what was going on. I want to make that abundantly clear. If you go back to the 1930s, some of the largest companies that utilize asbestos, Johns Manville comes to mind. We'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. They were the largest miner, miller, and product producer in the world for asbestos. They owned mines up in Canada. They made end products. They sold to other companies. They did it all. They actually hired a gentleman, Dr. Lanzo, from Mutual Life Insurance Company out of New York, or Metropolitan Life Insurance, excuse me, had him come to their industry facilities, look at all the workers and realize that they were all sick, and essentially cook the books, change the stats on how many workers were becoming sick due to asbestos, and make it seem as if these folks were sick prior to getting to work there and just not tying it to the Johns Manville asbestos exposures. There's what's called the conspiracy of silence, where these large companies that made asbestos products didn't tell anyone. They talked about it amongst themselves, but they didn't pass that information on, excuse me, to the workers or anyone else. There's a famous incident that happened, I think, in the mid-1970s when one of the presidents of these companies, his name was Sumner Simpson, he passed away. And when people were rifling through his desk, they found what are now called the Sumner-Simpson papers. The Sumner-Simpson papers were communications between him and other presidents of asbestos companies talking about the fact that their asbestos kills people, talking about how do we handle this, what do we do? Well, the solution that they came to was essentially, it's not going to happen for a really long time when they're talking about this in the 40s and 50s. So let's just not really worry about it for now. And that's bore out time and time again when you look at these documents. One defendant comes to mind, a purchasing agent by the name of E.A. Martin was talking about with a friend related to working with asbestos. He was another executive at one of these companies and says, you know, if the individual made a good life and supported his family working with asbestos, well, if he dies by asbestos, it is what it is. I use that document whenever I have a trial against that defendant. Sometimes it's excluded because it could be prejudicial, the judge thinks, as to my claims, but it's a document that is seeing similar things with similar defendants throughout the litigation. But what you'll have to do in each one of these cases is identify the defendants and either have access to that sort of information that we have and we know about being practicing asbestos and mesothelioma attorneys, or if it's a newer defendant and there's not sort of those smoking gun of liability stories, you have to work it up. You have to develop that information. And I was just talking about that railroad company where I had the corporate representative deposition. That's what I did. We had a 7 or 8 hour deposition where I took him through documents started in the 1920s. And that deposition will be played at trial for the jurors to see in terms of the liability of the defendants and what they knew and when they knew it. So damages, well, these damages are almost all non-economic. We talked about the latency period. What does that mean in terms of being diagnosed? Folks aren't diagnosed until they are in their 60s or 70s for the most part. And that means that most of them are retired. Most of them are just getting to be retired. They aren't working, so you're not going to have a lot of lost wages or anything like that. Now, you will have extensive medical bills, but again, the medical bills will only last for the treatment of the individual and then hospice at the end. There could be a major surgery. Sometimes there's something called a pleurectomy, where they literally try to remove the lining of the lung via a very invasive surgery. But this is not going to be you're in the hospital for 10 years or require, extensive medical treatment for the remainder of your life. Your life is simply not that long, so there aren't that many opportunities to have economic losses. And the non-economic damages, obviously you have physical pain, you have suffering, the emotional pain, loss of enjoyment of life, loss of consortium. That is one of the main claims in these cases. The wife or the husband of the diseased individual will have their loss of consortium claim. And those are very, very powerful and important claims. But one of the main things that we have is the sort of loss of dignity claim. For a lot of our clients, whether they're male or female, but in particular, some of the men who are diagnosed, they worked in the blue collar professions for their entire lives. They are the breadwinner in their family. They've been sort of the support system for their family. They've retired. They are now sort of the patriarch, the pillar of their family with kids and grandkids. And they go from being what has always been the sort of caretaker provider role to being the one that they are having to be taken care of and people are worrying about. They go from being that person who's able to do everything to that person who cannot do anything. And the amount of depression that sinks in on these gentlemen's faces, and of course the women as well, but it's something to behold. I don't think many of these folks who I work with on a regular basis are overly emotional individuals, but when they talk about what they're going through and how they're feeling and how it makes them feel, they often can't help but become very emotional. So we just have a few more slides and then we'll be done for the day. This is just sort of the history of asbestos litigation. As you can see, back in the 1920s, when we first have asbestosis being officially recognized, we had a couple lawsuits filed in the 50s, but nothing major. The 1960s is when it really started. Mr. Ward Stevenson here in Texas filed a couple asbestosis claims against some of the asbestos insulators and won those cases. And then over the course of time, as more and more of these cases popped up, it became more and more evident that there was something very, very wrong here. And that's when the asbestos litigation really took off in the 1970s, which began to include mesothelioma cases. And then they really skyrocketed in the 1980s and into the 2000s when there was extensive litigation and lots of firms all over the country started popping up and kind of providing that cookie cutter industry of just asbestos mesothelioma type litigation. And then, of course, in the 1990s, as everyone knows who is a plaintiff's attorney or a defense attorney, there is tort reform, which has substantially changed what happens with asbestos litigation. There are certain states that we really can't litigate in anymore. There are certain states that are still very good for litigating, and it just depends on where the exposure occurred, where the individual is living, and where the defendant companies are based. So bankruptcy issues, the first bankruptcy was back in 1982. That was Johns Manville. And that was essentially them throwing their arms up and saying, hey, we can't continue to be a solvent company anymore with all of these, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lawsuits that are against us. Johns Manville, I believe, was the largest company at the time to have ever filed for bankruptcy. That has changed since then. Other large companies have filed, obviously. But they were the first, and it was because of asbestos litigation. But it was also, I take that back, it wasn't because of asbestos litigation. It was because of what they did brought on so much asbestos litigation. They are singularly probably the most responsible for most people's asbestos injuries. Doesn't mean that other companies that were utilizing asbestos aren't responsible too, but they had a role in a lot of it. So then you have recent bankruptcies such as Johnson & Johnson. Everyone, or at least most people, have probably seen or heard about this. This is a little bit different, and it's something that we're dealing with more regularly now than we ever were in the past. So essentially what Johnson & Johnson did is they, without getting too technical, spun off all of their liabilities into a shell corporation and then put a little bit of cash in that shell corporation. And then that company filed for bankruptcy. And the healthy company, Johnson & Johnson, which maintained all of the actual money and the ability to sell products, just continues to operate. It has all the assets, none of the liabilities, and it continues to go about its day. I think it's a $450 billion market cap company. So you have this new situation where they're using a special law in Texas, it's referred to as the Texas two-step, to file this bankruptcy and preclude individuals who are diagnosed with either ovarian cancer or mesothelioma or any of the other asbestos-related issues from seeking remedy via the traditional tort system. And what they're utilizing is what came out of the Johns Manville bankruptcy in 1982, and that's the 524G trust system. And essentially what the courts did is they said, okay, we have all these folks who are seeking claims based on their asbestos exposure. You want to file for bankruptcy, Johns Manville. You want to reorganize, but you can't just do that. You have to do something to help these people and compensate these people in the future. So what they did is they've set up these trusts, little pools of money that are supposed to help people who are later on diagnosed with these issues. Now, those are what you see in the commercials, where you see where they say a certain amount of money, billions have been set aside for individuals diagnosed with mesothelioma. Well, if you take all the trusts, and there are about 100 of them now in the aggregate, that is correct. There have been billions set aside for those folks. The problem is when you take all the individuals who have been diagnosed with these diseases and you try to compensate them fairly, what they end up getting is truly pennies on the dollar. I always use Johns Manville as the example for this. Every single person who's diagnosed with mesothelioma is given a settlement by Johns Manville of $350,000, which sounds like a lot of money, especially if it's just one of the trusts that you're eligible for. But you get paid out at, I think, 4%. So you get 4% of that, and it comes out to be $14,000 or $15,000 or something like that. So that's the amount of money the individual who's been diagnosed with mesothelioma gets from Johns Manville. And that's for a mesothelioma. And the other cancers, the asbestoses, those sorts of disorders are compensated at a schedule much lower. So that's the most you can possibly get. And every single one of these trusts operates that same way. And that's what Johnson & Johnson is trying to set up at some point, one of these trusts that will compensate these people, but at a much lower level. Now, the good thing about these trusts, if there has to be one, is that the burden of proof is much lower than in a traditional tort case. So you don't need to have as much evidence. You don't need to prove as much. It's going to be easier access to money, but the money for these folks who have been harmed is much, much lower. So just common defendants, types of cases. Well, you have your automotive cases, you have your construction cases, your Navy cases. You don't sue the Navy. Sovereign immunity is something that we're not challenging here. You sue the manufacturers of the products that installed that equipment on the ships, on the submarines, et cetera. I had a case recently up in New York with a gentleman who was a 20-year captain on naval nuclear submarines. He wrote on the USS Nautilus, captained a bunch of other ones around the world, and did a lot of amazing things. Well, those subs, unfortunately, are full of asbestos. And in his 70s, after becoming a lawyer and a judge after being in the Navy, was diagnosed with mesothelioma. He's still living. He's not doing very well, but he's still living. So those are the Navy sorts of cases that we have. We have the take-home cases. I've mentioned those where the people get exposed at their house, talc cases, electrical workers, industrial site maintenance folks. And then there's some really weird things. And there are a lot of these, and I won't even get into most of them, but this is one of the reasons it's important to have someone who really knows what they're doing, talking to these folks about their potential exposures. Bowling balls, pizza ovens, dental tape, all of that stuff had asbestos. I had a case out in California where an individual was in charge of drilling the finger holes in bowling balls. Well, it just so happened that the same gentleman I was talking about who wrote that letter, who said that if you work with asbestos, it's okay if you die with asbestos, his company was selling their extra asbestos to a bowling ball company, and that bowling ball company was putting it into their bowling balls as a filler. The bowling ball company wasn't told that the asbestos was dangerous. Well, should they have known? Maybe. But certainly the company that was selling the asbestos should have known. So there's very, very strange ways where people can also be exposed to asbestos. Current state of the litigation, there are fewer and fewer solvent defendants. So, you have more and more people, companies that are filing for that bankruptcy. Some of them are legitimate, or at least, meant to protect the company and have them restructure and be operational. Some are more the Johnson & Johnson appearance of, a $450 billion company filing for bankruptcy, saying it can't afford to pay people suing them for asbestos claims. We didn't mention this, and it's very important. I meant to earlier. So the number of mesotheliomas is 2,500 to 3,000 a year. That's in the United States. That's been constant since the 1950s and 60s. It doesn't seem to be really going down. Defendants argue that that's a indication that because asbestos is utilized less often, that means that there is spontaneous mesotheliomas, ones that just come out of nowhere. Well, until recently, no one would have ever considered talc to be an asbestos-containing product. So whenever those individuals who have been diagnosed with mesothelioma were asked about whether they have exposures, no one ever counted talc until within the past 10 or 15 years. So it actually makes sense that all these women who are still getting mesothelioma, well, they were extensive talcum powder users. So we still pursue cases all over the country. It really is a national practice. That's one of the reasons I'm based here in Dallas. We have cases in the U.S. Virgin Islands, in New York, Wisconsin, Arizona, Alabama, all over the place. I know that a lot of you guys are from Alabama, so you may know that Alabama has some serious restrictions in place related to asbestosis or asbestos cases and mesothelioma. If the exposures occurred before 1980, they're non-compensable because of a statute of limitations ruling by your state Supreme Court. With that said, we're often able to file some of these cases in other jurisdictions and receive some compensation for the folks if we can't actually pursue it and litigate it in Alabama. Defendants in these cases vigorously defend them. It is not a find the company that you allege caused the exposure and the diagnosis and there will be a settlement. That's not how it works anymore. I've been told that's how it worked at one point in time, maybe in the 1990s. But today you have to litigate these cases. You have to take these cases to trial or prepare them for trial and hope for settlement at that point. They're expensive cases. They cost on anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000 to litigate. They are not cheap. And that certainly depends on the type of case. The talc cases are more expensive than your traditional asbestos cases, but they're extensively utilizing experts. And you have to travel around the country to meet with these clients, meet with these individuals who may have testimony related to product identification and all that sort of stuff. And then expert issues. Some of the experts that are involved in the litigation are getting pretty old. They've been doing this since the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So you have folks who are getting up there in years, and we are in the process constantly of finding new and working up new experts who can help us do the things that we need to do. So that's the presentation. I think I was a little bit over an hour. I apologize for that. But if anyone has any questions, the Q&A is open. It looks like I have one question there from Cassandra Velarde. What is the status of the Johnson & Johnson talcum powder / ovarian cancer litigation? So there was the bankruptcy that I explained earlier. And they did, in fact, file for bankruptcy in North Carolina. It was transferred up to New Jersey, where Johnson & Johnson is based. And the attorneys on behalf of the plaintiffs, the claimants, essentially moved to have the bankruptcy dismissed, and that was overruled. That was denied. The bankruptcy is moving forward. At this point, I believe there is an appeal in the process related to that ruling. But if there's going to be a change to what's occurring, in my opinion, it's going to take legislation. It's going to require Congress to pass a law that outlaws the usage of this tactic known as the Texas two-step. The courts have reviewed it at this point. We were excited about the case being transferred up to New Jersey. We thought that would be a better venue for the bankruptcy court to review these arguments, but our motions were denied. So there is an extensive group that's working on that on behalf of the claimants. But this isn't the first time they've done this or a defendant has done this. Other very healthy companies that you may have heard of already did this. It didn't gain as much attention when they did it, but it's becoming more of a kind of media sort of thing that people are talking about. Georgia-Pacific did it as well with their asbestos liabilities. A massive French company called Saint-Gobain did it as well with their asbestos liabilities. That was done in 2020 and Georgia-Pacific, I think, in 2019. So it's not anything new, but it's kind of angering people and some legislatures. So we'll see if they're able to do anything about it via actual legislation. I see one person, DeHaskins, simply wrote, how does? I'm not sure if you have a question there, but I'll give you guys just a minute or so. If we don't have any other questions, then I really appreciate it. Hope you all learned a lot. You feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I think the video and the slideshow will be made available for everyone. Yes, Raymond, we do have a handout of the slides. I believe that they will be emailed. I won't be handling that because if I were to handle that, you guys probably wouldn't ever get them. But I think someone from Beasley is going to make sure that both the video and the slides will be available for anyone who wants them. Okay, well, I appreciate it, everyone. I hope you all learned something. Have a good day.